Excellent. Welcome, everyone. This is the Rotary Cutter Tool School by Fiskars. I'm Dan Cunningham. We're going to give about a minute, but I'm based here at the Fiskars headquarters of the U.S. in Madison, Wisconsin. If you're interested in letting us know where you're watching from, post it in the comments. All right, that's probably about enough time. So I'll again introduce myself. My name is Dan Cunningham. I work at Fiskars. I'm joined here with two of my coworkers, Holly and Bree, and they'll be in the chat if you have questions from there. But today I'm going to be presenting about rotary cutters, specifically the Fiskars rotary cutters. This is intended as a tool school. So you'll learn about what the rotary cutters are, what makes them tick, what makes one better than another. And hopefully by the end, you'll even learn a few things about maybe some other tools that you might like to pick up on your next trip to Michael's. So to get started, the first half of the presentation is going to mainly be talking about the rotary cutters in general. The second half will have some of the accessories that you would use with rotary cutters. And then at the end, we'll definitely have some time to ask questions to me. I'm an engineer here at Fiskars, so I've actually had my hands in a lot of these tools that you do see at the Michael's shelf. And so it kind of gives me an interesting insight into what makes them tick. And I'm here to kind of help you understand that as well. So to get started, turn off full screen. So the first step in understanding a rotary cutter is to really look at the very high level basics of what a rotary cutter is. At first glance, you might think that looks like a pizza cutter, whereas in a lot of ways, it is similar to a pizza cutter. It has a blade at the front that's doing the actual cutting. It's got a handle that you hold so you're not touching the sharp blade. And then because the blade is sharp, it usually has some safety features. Now, in each of those things, there's a variety of blade sizes, which we'll get into. There's a few different variations of handles, and there's a couple different variations of safety features. And the way that you combine each of those aspects gives you a huge range of different kinds of rotary cutters. So when you go to the shelf, you might think, well, what do I choose? There's so many different kinds. And here, we can break it down into mainly those three things: the blades, the handles, and the safety features. So to start, you might think, all right, what blade do I want to use? And that is going to be dictated by what you're trying to do mainly with the rotary cutter. In general, there are three sizes of blades. There are small, medium, and large. More specifically, we measure them in millimeters. There are 28 millimeters, which are the smallest, 45 millimeters, which is the medium size, and 60 millimeters, which are generally the largest size. There are a couple other variations you might see on the market, but these are the primary three. Of these three, I would say the middle of the road, the 45 millimeters, is the most common. Well, because that is kind of the jack of all trades. It can do most everything that you want it to do. Because it's the most common, it's also usually the least expensive of the three sizes of the blades. Almost every kind of handle can accommodate this medium 45 millimeter size blade. But there are ones, like I mentioned, one slightly smaller and one slightly bigger. So in general, if you're looking at a blade for a universal all-around size, that 45 is the way to go. But there may be cases where you might be able to use a different size blade to make your task easier. Specifically, if you have a lot of short or very freehand curves, like if you're cutting out, I don't know, a wave quilt or a lot of circles or applique patterns, you might want to use something that is smaller. so the 28mm blade, is going to make going around curves easier. So for instance, if I have a pattern that requires tight circles, a larger blade like the 45mm is going to be able to not as turn a corner quite as tightly as something like a 28mm blade. So it's those situations that you might want to use a smaller blade. Now, a downside to the smaller 28mm blade is that they're a little rarer on the market. You might not find every handle style that you like that can fit a 28mm blade. But when you do find them, they can do those specific tasks very well. Now, on the other side, you might see 60mm blades. They're significantly larger. They have a couple of good things going for them. One is, depending on the handle specifically, you might be able to have more blade exposed out the front of the tool. That might be the case, might be useful if you have a large quilt stack with thick batting inside that you want to use and dig deeper down into that material. Having more exposed blade with the 60 would help you there. Now, there is a downside to the 60mm in that, because it's such a large blade, it's going to have trouble going around any sort of curve at all. You can make really large arcs, but really the 60mm blades, the largest, are intended for very straight cuts, especially those against rulers, which we'll get to in just a few minutes. But if you have long, straight cuts, that 60mm would be the way to go. A caveat with that is, sometimes if you do have a ruler, you have to be careful that you don't climb up on the edge of the ruler and go off or kind of stray off to the side. So with that larger diameter, that can tend to happen a little bit more. But those are the three primary sizes of blades. Now, once you kind of understand what blade size you want, next you can start looking at what kind of handles you're looking for. I like to break them up into two camps. One is the handles that are straight. And what I mean by that would be a handle that, when you expose the blade, is straight in line with where that blade is exposed. So in this example, this handle is straight in line with where the blade is exposed the most. And the same with this small one. Now, these often are called stick handles, but they're just generally straight. Now, on the flip side, there are bent handles, which don't actually bend on their own. It just means they're at an angle from the blade. So as an example here, I have this one. As I expose the blade, it pushes it down right here. Oh, it's a little shiny, but you can see down here is where the blade is exposed the most. And that creates an angle with the handle, or it's bent. Now, the reason you might want to do this becomes a little more apparent when you figure out how you're going to hold the tool when you're using it. So for example, if I have a straight handle, or stick in this case, and I expose the blade, I have to tilt upward, and my wrist is actually set at an angle in order to fully push down on it in the correct way in order to cut all the way through. On the other flip side, if I have this bent, now when I expose the blade, I can have it go straight down on the fabric without bending my wrist as much. It's a much more neutral angle for your wrist to be at. So in general, the bent handle is going to typically be a little more ergonomic to use. Now, a downside to that bent handle is, now if I'm a lefty, well, now I can't see the blade when I'm holding it with my left hand. Now, you can remove the blade assembly, flip it onto the other side, and be able to put it back, and then you're fine forever. But the stick style, when you have a stick style like this, if I cut with my right hand or with my left hand, it doesn't matter. It's symmetric either way. So sticks, the straight handles, are especially good when it is a shared tool. If you have people that are left-handed and right-handed, both wanting to use the same tool on and off. If you have a bent version, then you need two tools to trade on and off, which can be a little less convenient. There are two styles of bent, which we'll get to. And it has to do with the safety features. So let me move on to the next slide to talk about that third aspect of the safety features. Now, the rotary cutter blades look like pizza cutters, but they are razor sharp. These rotary blades are extremely sharp. They're some of the sharpest blades that you'll ever find. And because of that, people really don't like to be around them or leave them in unsafe ways. So every rotary cutter has some method of making the blade safer. Usually it's in the form of a guard or moving the blade into a stored safe position. Now, there are two methods of doing that. I have them highlighted here. You're either moving the guard or you're moving the blade. And if I flip back, normally in our versions, the stick versions, they have a guard that slides away. Ooh, that got nice and shiny. So that guard is protecting the blade when it's pushed forward, so you can't accidentally cut yourself, or if you drop it, it won't cut. In order to use it, you pull that guard away. Now, what a moving guard does is it gives you a very solid, rigid connection to that blade. The blade doesn't itself slide. One downside to that is sometimes it's a little harder to tell whether it is guarded or not. So you usually just get into the habit of anytime you set it down, you re-engage the guard. It's a very easy one finger click for all of these types of things. Now, on the other side, if you have something, well, I guess this one also moves the guard. This has got an interesting mechanism that wraps around the blade with just kind of one little motion. The other side is by moving the blade. So the blade in this case, as well as in this case, it is already surrounded by the handle. It's safe. You can't get to the blade. It's in a safe position. But normally, these types of things, you push on something. In this case, it's a button on the top that then pushes the blade down, and now it's exposed down below the handle. You have a button on the side, in this case, that would pop it back into place. And this is a lot easier to see if it is protected or not. You can see if it's in a dangerous state or see if it's back where it's always protected. The other way, we have a trigger version that if you pull up on that trigger, the blade moves down. This has the added benefit to when you set it down, it automatically becomes safe. It automatically becomes protected. And for that extra layer of that safety, it does have a button that you can push that actually locks it. So then you have no chance of being able to, leave it there and have a child or a cat jump up on the table and accidentally open it up. So it's locked in a very safe position. So with all of those safety features, combined with the different handles, combined with the sizes of blades, now, when you take a look at what's on the shelf at Michael's, you might start to see some things that'll help you choose. So for instance, you want a small 28 millimeter, very simple, easy to use, that maybe you and a partner who is left-handed are going to use collaboratively. In that case, the highlighted one would be perfect for you. It's the combination of all of those three things. Well, what if you want to make mostly long, straight cuts and you love that extra safe trigger so that you squeeze it and it becomes extra safe? Then the highlighted one might be for you. Well, what if you are not at risk of someone coming in and touching it, and you still like the idea of turning it on, not having to hold it? Then the one at the top here might be for you, where you push the trigger down, it moves the blade, and then until you push the button, that blade is active and ready to use. So now if you analyze those three aspects, the blade size, the handle type, and the safety features, you can see why each of those tools that are out on that shelf will be a little bit different, and you might help you in picking the right one for you. Using a rotary, so I have an extra kind of interesting little tool here. I call it a cool tool. And I've been showing it off a few times. This actually has an easy blade change feature. So when the blades get dull, and they eventually do after you've made a quilt or two, they do stay sharp for a very long time. But when you go to replace the blades, on most rotary cutters, it's as simple as unscrewing a knob and pushing it out onto the table, and then very carefully, pulling it to the edge of the table, and lifting it out, wrapping it. A lot of people wrap it to keep it safe, and then disposing of it. Well, we do understand at Fiskars, some people don't even like the aspect of sliding it on the table. So we said, well, what if we took a traditional rotary cutter, the same idea, where you unscrew this knob on the one side, but then there is a small lever that flips up, doesn't get in the way while you're using it, but then when you lift up on that lever, the magnet inside pulls the blade with it and allows you to lift it away. You never have to drop it, set it, and then you can wrap it and do what you need, put on a new one, right on to that same post as before, and then you can put it right back in place and put that back on with hardly ever needing to touch it. So it just makes it a much easier experience. And at the same time, it's not even sticking out any other way. It's no different than most others. So this was a handy little feature we added to this 45mm easy blade change rotary cutter. And people tend to really like how easy that is. Another cool tool having to do with rotary cutters is a little bit different. It's a little more specific, and it might not look like a rotary cutter. This is the fabric circle cutter. So a fabric circle cutter is intended for the one goal in mind, to cut perfect circles out of fabric easily, quickly, and at many different sizes. And then the way that works has to do with a guide that it comes with, as well as a rotary cutter housed in a different type of handle. Now, 3 aspects. We've got blade. In this case, it's small, so it can go around a small radius very easily. It's got the handle. In this case, it's a whole hand handle for a reason probably obvious from the video, but it also has the safety features of the fact that it's spring-loaded. So while it's inside, it's covered, and you can't use it. But if I flip over and lay out a piece of fabric onto my cutting mat, I take that guard, the half circle guard, and line up a fold. So I've got it right on the fold right here. Then I choose the circle size, lay it down in the guide, and just spin around nicely. Come around, and you've cut out a very nice circle with just one action, very smooth edges. You can just iron that seam right out of there, and you've got a perfect circle for you to make DIY crafts, make part of a quilt. It's really up to you when you need to use a circle. This is a great tool for you to have kind of set beside you. So we've talked about a couple cool tools, but I've got something in front of me as well as some other things that we really haven't talked about. And that's because when you use a rotary cutter, it's really a system of tools. I've talked mostly about the cutter itself, but in most cases, you're also going to need at least one other thing, the cutting mat, but in most cases, you'll also need a sewing ruler. Now, the rotary cutter, we talked at length. The cutting mat is a method that you don't damage whatever is underneath. Now, because the rotary cutter blades are so sharp, if you did it on a tabletop, you would ruin your tabletop in no time. It would make lines and cuts. It'd be almost like taking a kitchen knife and just, instead of using a cutting board, just cutting right on your surface. That's not a good idea. So a cutting mat is an object that you're going to cut on. Most cases, the cutting mats are going to be self-healing, and Fiskars is no exception to that. The plastic that's used within it has the ability to be split and then close back up, mostly almost back to new. It's not quite back to new, but it's almost back to new. And in that way, you've got this flat surface without gouges for you to be able to work on for many years. There is a variety of different kinds of cutting mats, from the smallest down at this 12-inch by 18-inch, up to the 4 times as large, 24-inch by 36-inch. There is an additional interesting, this 14 by 14 rotating. What I mean by that is it literally can spin on a separate base. And this is great when you're cutting different angles of things, or you want to reorient kind of how you are positioned so that you don't have to spin the fabric. It's just a very handy little tool for you to be able to reposition what you're working on without having to move around your table or lift up the fabric in any way. There's also the larger two sizes. Fiskars has a version that are folding cutting mats. Now I'll highlight that on the next slide. These are cool tools as well. The medium size 18 by 24 folding mat folds in half down to a 12 by 18, just a little bit bigger than an 11 by 17 sheet of paper. I have that right here with me. It's much easier to put into a bag or lay next to you on the seat in your car. But these great big 24-inch, the 2-foot by 3-foot versions, those folds into thirds, and those fold down to a 12-inch by 24. So about the same width, just a little bit taller in this case. Now, there's some interesting features of these as well. You might have noticed the wavy edge on here. You can imagine if this were not a wavy edge and you opened it up and you tried to cut at really close to where that line was, you might end up falling into that cut edge unless it were wavy. In this case, by making it this wavy edge, you don't fall into those cracks. You don't fall into a straight line and drift off away from the pattern that you're trying to cut. Additionally, on the underside of these folding mats have a non-slip layer, a foam layer, so that you have a little bit of cushion to it, as well as to not slip on your tabletop as you're using it. So some extra nice features about those folding mats. The other accessory that almost everyone uses with a rotary cutter are sewing rulers. So most times that you're cutting, especially with large rotary cutters, you're cutting straight edges. So if I have a pattern, or a quilt that I'm making, you wouldn't make it out of felt, but if I have a quilt that I'm making, you would line this up and measure and mark and then lay out a straight edge. And then by placing your rotary cutter up against the edge of that and just pulling to the side as you're going straight along, you're going to create this perfect cut edge in a very straight line without having to draw the lines or follow it with scissors or anything like that, by using this straight edge. Most of our sewing rulers have some thickness to them. They're thicker than you might get if it were a small metal ruler. And that would help you to not climb up on the edge of the ruler as you're going, to stay right along the edge of that ruler so that you don't drift off that edge. Looking at the varieties that we have, they do get down to a small 6.5 by 6.5 size, but they get all the way up to the one I have here is just a kind of the middle of the road. Well, it's the larger of the square. It's a 12.5 by 12.5, but they do get up to a 24-inch long by 6 inches wide. This will do almost everything that you want to do with this 2-foot length to it. The orange lines on some of these other ones are actually 1/2-inch seam allowances. So you don't have to do any additional measuring or calculating. You do have to make sure you're not measuring this as the 0, because otherwise you'd be adding 1/2 inch. But this gives you the flexibility to either have a seam allowance or not have that seam allowance. There is an additional 6 by 24, and because we know you're often trying to manage your storage space as much as you can, this 16 by 24 ruler comes folding as well. And so this is a ruler that has two seams. It's 3 parts along the way that kind of zigzag out. So it stores in a very reasonable 6-inch by 8-inch size, but it opens up to the full 6-inch by 24-inch straight line edge. And we take care to make sure that edge is perfectly straight. As I run my finger along it, I can hardly even feel where that edge is. So very handy and fancy, and able to kind of store in a bag or store in a drawer very, very easily. So with that, we've covered the accessories of rotary cutters, the basics of rotary cutters, and now we're going to open it up to some questions for either me or my colleagues about rotary cutters in general, the tools, Fiskars specifically. It's really open to what? And so I hope you enjoyed and learned something.
No questions so far. We did have someone ask about if they should use these rotary cutters with fabric or if we have paper ones. I did send them the link for the paper cutter, but if you want to give any insights as to why we would prefer they use these just for fabric.
So the rotary cutters are extremely sharp. They're razor sharp. And right out of the package, they will cut fabric and paper equally well. But because they're so incredibly sharp, when you're cutting paper, it will wear down that blade edge significantly faster. And so something that you use to cut paper may not cut fabric as well after you've cut paper with it. So, to be honest, I do cut a lot of paper with a rotary cutter, but I keep that separate. I have my paper rotary cutter, which does amazing things and works really well. But I also have my fabric rotary cutter, and I make sure and don't mix those because the paper does wear out the rotary blades significantly faster. So if you can keep it down to just, the rotary cutter for your fabric and then use a paper trimmer that won't wear out as quickly, then that would be a good way to do it too.
We do have 2 questions about sharpening blades or using new ones.
Excellent questions. And we get that a lot, actually. So there are products out on the market that supposedly will sharpen rotary cutter blades. And as engineers at Fiskars, we're very curious whether that's something that actually works or not. And in our testing, we have found that most of the time, you will never be able to recover anywhere close to the sharpness of a new blade with a rotary sharpener. Now, in theory, if you were to use your rotary blade so much that, say, it was a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being brand new, 0 being dull, and you could touch it with your finger. If you wore it down to, say, 10%, then a rotary sharpener tool can often pull it back up, I don't know, to 50%, 40%. I've never seen any rotary sharpening tool that can pull it up above and anywhere close to that 100%. I will mention, especially for 45 millimeter blades, they can often come in bulk packs. And when you buy it as, say, a 5-pack, then it makes it very easy to, and essentially no time to make that swap out for you to get a new blade. So that's typically what we recommend is the rotary sharpeners don't do a lot. And additionally, they're often not the safest things. It requires you to handle the blades more. Whereas if you use something like the Easy Blade Change, you handle the blade very little. You just take the new one and put it on, and you take the old one and you take it off. So I hope that helps to answer that question.
Yes, and while you're on that, quite a bit of people are asking on how they should dispose of the blades. Do you have an answer for that at all, Dan?
I don't so I know the way I do it, and I know a lot of consumers, what they'll do is they'll take, say, duct tape. They'll take it and carefully pinch duct tape around the outside edge, and that's mainly to help protect, not cut through the bag of the garbage or whatever you're using. If you a rotary blade is sometimes, it's very sharp, but you can also sometimes have glass shards that you're disposing of. And you would use that kind of in the same way. If you have something that's sharp, you can dispose of it, whether you put it in a cardboard box so that the garbage man or woman doesn't cut themselves. That's kind. But there is, at this point, it's not something you can take to a specific disposal place that I know of. But, Bree, do you have any other thoughts on that?
No, that's kind of what I would think about. And if you do buy like the replacement blades, you can maybe use the packaging from the new blade and put the old blade in there and kind of then you can like tape it up or whatever and throw it away that way. So then it's kind of safe in the garbage.
Yeah. I forgot about that. So the bulk packs often come in these rigid plastic containers that are actually really great for when you have 5 or more blades that you want to dispose of. They can hold those used blades very well, and then you put a single piece of tape over it and it'll keep it closed. That's a great way to do that.
All right, we're still getting quite a bit of questions. One other good one was, do you have any left-handed circle rotary cutters?
So we actually pride ourselves in every single one of the rotary cutters that we have is left and right. And I mentioned this while we talked about the stick a little bit, in that every stick is actually symmetric. So whether you're using it left-handed or right-handed, it's the same. But I can demonstrate, if you have one that is a bent tool like this, they come typically configured for right-handed people so that they can see the blade as you're cutting across your body. But in all cases, it's as easy as, and I actually can use the easy blade change as the example. If you take this and flip the tool over, then when you reassemble it on the opposite side of the tool, line up the little flat. Oh, why isn't that lining up? User error. Not seeing the flat. There it is. I'm just distracted by other things. Then when you can reassemble it in this side and tighten it back down, now it's in a position that a righty will not be able to see the blade, but a lefty now can see that blade right in line with them. And so in a way, every one of our rotary cutters is a lefty and a righty, depending on how you put the blade on.
I'm just looking through here.
Sure.
There is a question about, if you're using a cutter to cut a clothing pattern, should you avoid cutting the pattern through the paper pattern?
That's a great question. Usually a fabric pattern paper is a very thin paper. They are not abrasive at all. The blade won't care in that case. You know, if you looked in the lifetime of the tool, usually that would become such a small amount of wear on those blades that it shouldn't matter at all. When I'm talking about paper wearing down a blade, I'm usually talking about if you're doing a craft paper, especially if you're using it in a DIY setting where you have maybe glitter paper or something that's got metal flake in it. Those will wear things out very quickly. But fabric patterns, go for it. I think that's fine. Don't hit pins, actually. That's one of the things that we often see is, and I've done it to myself, when I'm pinned my fabric pattern in place and I forget and I roll over a pin, it could be that 99% of the blade is still sharp, but I put a little bit of a dent in one edge of it. Now, whenever I'm rolling, I'm leaving a thread every once in a while. So just be aware that rolling over pins can damage your blade.
Another question, do rotaries need to be cleaned or oiled?
Great question. So all of our rotaries come from the factory with a layer of oil on it, and that's intended so that while it's being shipped, they don't damage each other, especially in bulk packs. In general, they are not going to tend to rust or anything like that. So we don't necessarily say you need to store them in oil or anything like that. It is nice to wipe them off occasionally, especially if you are cutting, I don't know, maybe a leather, might start to put some residue on it. Most cotton fabrics are not going to leave any residues. Sometimes over time, where you're making lots of cuts, you end up with thread on them, and then it just looks nicer to wipe it off. But in general, these blades will last a lifetime, last their lifetime without really any maintenance needed from you.
Another question, someone I think is asking about maybe the perforated blade. Do you want to talk about that a little more?
Yes, and I did just put a link to that to purchase it off of Michael's website. But
right,
please explain. Yeah.
Bree, can you please explain? So I know that the perforated blades exist. I have not actually used it myself. I do know that they are one of the traditional sizes of blade. I think the one you linked to is a 45, kind of that middle of the road, that has notches that aren't sharp. So that as you roll along, you're creating this zigzag, or not a zigzag, a dotted line of cuts. I'm not sure in which situations you would use that?
So it sounded like the person who was asking for them was talking about crocheting. So I think it's if you're trying to make a pattern with how you're sewing,
Oh,
then you have like a straight line of where your thread needs to go.
okay. Well, I've now learned. That's very interesting. I'll have to look that up a bit. New hobbies are always fun to learn.
There's a lot of questions in here, so I'm just kind of filtering through. We got another question on, is there any handle that you would recommend for someone may that be elderly and have a little less strength in their hands?
Sure. So I would definitely recommend a bent style handle. That can get your wrist in a much more neutral position. Additionally, there is kind of within the bent, we have the two versions. One with a loop along the bottom. There's actually two versions with a loop on the bottom, and then one where you're squeezing the trigger. So the squeeze trigger is good for people with a little bit more hand strength. It has the added benefit of becoming automatically safe when you set it down, but it can be a little harder to kind of continually squeeze. Now, it does have that added benefit of that lock button that you can lock it so it's safe. Actually can also lock it so it's open. And so someone with a little less hand strength that wants really safe tools, you could use this where it's still, you then have to squeeze it, lock it open, and then it's kind of in that traditional exposed way. But for people with especially low hand strength, the ones with the thumb trigger is actually going to be kind of probably the most useful for you, where you do one action to push that forward and you use your entire kind of arm and thumb to do that. So it's not relying on a specific finger strength. And now it's in a position where now you can hold it. You don't have to squeeze it as you're going. You just hold it and orient it as you're cutting. So especially people with arthritis or people with low hand strength, the ones that we recommend are the ones that look like this.
Another question. What size and shape is the circle cutter? Can you show how the blade opens or the cutter opens and show the blade?
I'd love to. So the circle cutter, let me go back to this. The range of circles that it can make range from a 2-inch to a 12-inch circle. That includes a 1/4-inch seam allowance. So if you're going to be stitching that up. So in the actual circle size, and that is the diameter. So from one end to the circle to the other. So it ranges again from that 2 to 12 inches. And it goes every 1 inch. So, it's a 2-inch circle, 3-inch circle, 4-inch circle. Now the blade, the way that works, yeah, I can do this. It starts out kind of housed inside this handle. And then as you push down on, when you've got it positioned in the right groove, and you push down on it, that blade just automatically pushes down and through. There are guides. There we go. You can see there's little pegs, guides on the bottom side of this to make sure that you stay within this groove. So you're not following a path. There is actually a groove within this guide. So by following that path, it automatically orients the blade in the right direction. You don't have to worry about spinning or anything. You just kind of move your hand. It's spinning on its own. And by pushing down with just a little bit of pressure, you can then complete that cut. I just dropped it, but it does have a guard. There it is. That for storage, even though this is safe at this point, for storage, you can put the plastic guard on top. And this protects it kind of even more, that you can put this in a drawer or a bag, and there's then no risk to cutting anything. Hope that helps.
Still getting a couple more questions. I'm going to keep going. Does the cutting mat wear out from cutting on it?
So our cutting mats, I mentioned this early, what we would consider self-healing. They are not a perfect 100% self-healing. They don't rejoin, but the cut edge that you're creating within that will close back up and just hide. If you are making a quilt and making 100 different squares of all the same dimensions, and you're measuring from exactly the same point every time, by the time you're done cutting all of those things right along that edge, you will start to see some wear. And that's inevitable. You have this razor sharp blade that you're pushing into a piece of plastic that it's going to do something. Now, in general, if you're using it on an everyday basis, not in a situation where it is in exactly the same measurement every time, you're not going to notice much wear. What I like to recommend is if you are making a ton of different cuts all at the same point, make a conscious effort sometimes to shift your zero. Shift up to now I'm going to measure from the 1 inch mark or measure from the 2 inch mark. And that way you're not making the exact same cut all 100 times. You're kind of shifting along as you go. Now, most people never have to worry about it. They're able to cut on their cutting mat for years and years and years. And you look down and you won't even really be able to see anything. I mean, I've been making cuts on this mat, and I know you have to take my word for it, but I don't really see anything on here. So most of the time, you'll never have to worry about wearing out a cutting mat unless you're doing that specific task over and over and over in exactly the same place.
Right. Another great question. Can you use the same blade size on different handles?
Same. Okay. So most of the time, and including all of Fiskars handles, they are made for one blade size. And that is because as you push down on the whatever action, you're either removing the guard or pushing the blade down, it's exposing a certain amount of blade. If you used a smaller blade in this handle, it would not stick out. And if you put a larger blade, it wouldn't be protected. I have heard of more universal rotary cutters that can accommodate different blade sizes. I have not found one that I was happy with or would want to own. Fiskars, so therefore I don't think Fiskars has ever made one. It's most of the time it's easy to acquire. If you have two favorite sizes, you might just find the one you use most, get a really good handle for that, and then maybe the one that you use occasionally, you get a lesser expensive handle for you to kind of take care of that second size.
Great. Someone else just asked if we were going to do a scissors class. And yes, we actually did a couple weeks ago, so I dropped that link into the chat for you to check out on Michael's YouTube as well.
Yeah, I was happy to present that.
Right now, I think we got to most of the questions. Oh, any last words, Dan?
No, I mean, it's always a pleasure to present to consumers. As an engineer, sometimes our job is to go out and talk to consumers, and that has become more difficult in the last year. But any opportunities that I have to hear from consumers, I love. And so if you are interested in reaching out, customer service at Fiskars is great. And sometimes if there's questions about engineering, they'll even come to me and say, hey, we have this question about a specific use case, or someone had a great idea for a new product. And those have really been fruitful in the last 10 years that I've been working at Fiskars. So if you're ever interested, just reach out. We're all friendly people. So thank you for the opportunity to present and teach you about rotary cutters.